Welcome everyone to the 2021 Virtual SMA Conference. This is Colleen McCarthy O'Toole from SMA's Family Support Department. We thank you all so much for joining us today for the Clinical Care and Research Update session. We are so grateful to our national presenting sponsors, Biogen, Genentech, and Novartis Gene Therapies for their incredible support for this year's Virtual SMA Conference. We would now like to introduce our speakers, Dr. Mary Schroth, Chief Medical Officer at SMA, and Jill Jarecki, Chief Scientific Officer at SMA. Jill?
Hi, thank you, Colleen. So thank you all for joining me today to discuss our research activities at SMA. Next slide, please. So at SMA, we have a comprehensive research funding program, and since our inception in 1984, have funded over $80 million in total research funding. And we fund basic research to understand disease biology and find ideas for therapeutic approaches, drug discovery to turn those ideas into practical new therapies, clinical and regulatory activities to efficiently approve these new drugs, and care research to improve patient care and quality of life. And you'll hear that in the next talk from Dr. Schroth. And then our research and clinical care meeting to share and promote progress in SMA. And our funding model is based on using independent and expert review by our different advisory boards, our SAB, our TAC, and our MAC. Next slide, please. Of course, the goal of all the research that we fund is to develop FDA-approved drugs to treat SMA. And from the discovery of the first gene until now, we've had 3 approved drugs. We've had the first one, Spinraza, to modulate SMN2 splicing in 2016, Zolgensma to replace the SMN1 gene in 2019, and most recently, Registry, a small molecule to correct SMN2 splicing last August in 2020. Next slide, please. And we track our progress in developing new drugs through our SMA drug pipeline, which you see here. The blue lines indicate the drugs that are in patients or FDA approved, the 3 that I just mentioned. And our goal in tracking the drug pipeline is to make sure that we have a robust drugs in earlier stages of development, different therapeutic approaches and ways to treat SMA, leading to hopefully combination approaches that'll have maximal effectiveness for all ages and stages of SMA. And just quickly highlight the 4th line on this bar, which is the Scholar Rock drug, which just released clinical trial data in the last few months, which I'll review shortly. Next slide, please. So today I'd like to talk about our research strategy in SMA in light of the evolving landscape. As I just discussed, we have these 3 new therapies, and they've revolutionized and dramatically changed the natural history of SMA. Early identification and treatment dramatically affects long-term outcomes, but most particularly in a pre-symptomatic context or in patients treated very soon after diagnosis. Symptomatic patients do get benefit from these diseases through modest increases in motor function, stabilization of the disease, and even a slowing of decline. But we have to keep in mind that currently 40% of all SMA patients currently remained untreated. So we still have work to do to have the same degree of effectiveness in our symptomatic patients as we do in our pre-symptomatically treated patients, even though we've had this dramatic progress in the last few years. Next slide. So what comes next? SMA is not cured. As I just said, we have different outcomes for symptomatic versus newborn screening patients. And we want more impact for our older patients at older ages and more chronically progressed stages of SMA. We want to be able to reverse and restore function in those patients. Right now, we can, if prevent further symptoms and even slower progression from what we have in natural history. But our long-term goal is to be able to restore function in symptomatic patients. Next slide, please. So before I go into talking about how we plan to execute on being able to develop drugs to be used in combination with the disease-modifying SMN upregulators, I wanted to quickly review the recent release of clinical trial data from Scholar Rock and also the other ongoing clinical trials in SMA. So recently, Scholar Rock released data for their drug. It's called the Topaz clinical trial. It's a phase 2 proof of concept study to test the safety and efficacy of their drug in patients with type 2 or type 3 SMA. It works by targeting a protein called myostatin and inhibiting its activation in muscle, and this results in muscle bulking and strengthening. Their trial had 55 patients between the ages of 2 and 21, and they received the drug every 4 weeks through intravenously, either alone or with an approved SMN upregulator like Spinraza, and the trial occurred over 12 months. Next slide, please. They had 3 different cohorts in the trial. The first cohort had patients between 5 and 21 years of age who had ambulatory type 3 SMA. And in that cohort, using the Hammersmith Functional Motor Scale, saw a 0.3 decline on that scale, which is about natural history for the disease. In the second cohort, which had a similar age range, but in non-ambulatory type 2 and type 3 patients, they saw a 0.6 increase, a modest increase, but likely more effect than you would expect to see in natural history. Next slide, please. In the third cohort, which was type 2 patients who had initiated nusinersen under 5 years of age. So they would receive both nusinersen and the Scholar Rock drug and were greater than 2 years old. And given when nusinersen was approved 5 years ago, this means that most of the patients would be under 10 years of age. So more narrow spread of patients than the first 2 cohorts. And this cohort had a very impressive change on the Hammersmith scale. At the high 20 milligram dose, they had a 7-point increase. This is larger than the increase that was seen in Cherish, the pivotal trial that was used to approve nusinersen in type 2 patients, which was between 4 and 5 points. So this is very encouraging results. And Scholar Rock has said they will initiate a phase 3 trial likely by the end of the year. Next slide, please. Biogen also has a clinical trial recruiting right now called DEVOTE. And DEVOTE is to look at higher doses of nusinersen or Spinraza. The first part of the trial has been completed. That was the safety part of the trial, where patients received 28 milligrams of nusinersen rather than the normal dose of 12 milligrams. They've now moved to and are enrolling for part B, where they are enrolling infantile or later onset SMA. They will have a placebo cohort where the participants receive the FDA label for nusinersen, which is 10 milligrams for the loading doses and for the maintenance doses. In the test cohort of the trial, patients will receive 50 milligrams for the loading doses and followed by 28 milligrams for maintenance doses. Eventually, they'll move on to a part C, which is in adult patients. The patients in cohort B will have to be under 6 months of age or 2 to 10 years of age. Next slide, please. Biogen has a second trial called Respond. In this trial, they are looking at nusinersen in participants with SMA who had been previously treated commercially with Zolgensma. There will be 60 participants, ages 3 to 36 months of age with 2 copies of SMN2. They must have previously received Zolgensma, and the clinical investigator must determine that they've had a suboptimal response to that drug. Next slide, please. Rainbowfish is also recruiting. This is a trial from Roche Genentech. It is a trial to look at risdiplam or Evrysdi in pre-symptomatic patients under 6 weeks of age. 25 infants will be in this trial, and there are 3 sites in the US at Columbia University, Nemours, and St. Jude's Hospital. Next slide, please. And finally, there's a trial that will begin to recruit soon from Novartis Gene Therapies called SMART. And this is to look at Zolgensma given intravenously as in the current FDA label. There'll be 24 participants, 3 months to 17 years. And these participants, one of the important inclusion criteria is that they must weigh between 8.5 kilograms but under 21 kilograms at the time of screening visit 2. They have to be naive to treatment or have discontinued another approved drug or therapy for SMA. Keep in mind that the current label for Zolgensma says the patients must weigh under 8.5 kilograms. So this trial will allow heavier patients to be enrolled. Next slide, please. So all of these trials, you can find more information on clinicaltrials.gov. I encourage you to go look them up there, and you can find contact information if you would like to participate. So, as I said, one of our strategic goals in research is to fund basic and translational research leading to combination therapies. And by combination therapies, we primarily mean disease-modifying drug that regulates SMN with some other mechanism of action or therapeutic approach. And I'll describe that to you during the rest of my talk. We also have a strategic goal in research to use funding through our industry collaboration and the PNCR clinical trial network to facilitate the testing and approval of these new drugs, where we want to have drugs which are maximally effective for older chronically symptomatic patients. And we fund things like trial infrastructure and trial site training, more sensitive outcome measures that are more appropriate for older patients, and also provide patient voice to regulators, drug developers, and payers. And then we have a third strategic goal to help understand the new SMA phenotype or classification by collecting patient-reported data. And I'll spend the rest of the talk telling you our goals and strategies in each of these 3 areas. Next slide, please. So we all know about the SMN dependent drugs, which we've already reviewed, either those that correct SMN2 splicing or Zolgensma, which replaces the SMN1 gene. Next slide, please. But our goals in combination therapy for combination therapies really revolve around SMN independent drugs. And on the right hand of this slide, you see what we call a motor circuit, which shows the motor neuron cell body in the spinal cord, sending an axon out to the muscle, and then sending signals back into the spinal cord with sensory motor neurons. And we believe that we can develop a cocktail drug approach for SMA by targeting all different molecular mechanisms around this motor circuit. For example, neuroprotection, which would prevent the motor neuron in the cell body from dying, neuronal transmission, which would cause the signaling between the motor neuron and the muscle out in the body to function more strongly. Regenerative targets, which may cause sprouting of the motor neuron onto the muscle, which would cause one motor neuron to cover a greater area of the muscle. Muscle enhancement, as we have with the Scholar-Rock drug, and then more agnostic approaches, which could be anywhere along this motor circuit, that just show that they have the ability to change phenotypes in animal models of SMA, and then using these in combination with SMN upregulators that are already approved. Next slide, please. So for the last few years, we have changed all of our funding programs for grants to both our basic research grant programs and our preclinical drug programs to really investigate how to identify targets for combinations and then test them in cellular or animal models of the disease. And all of our requests for proposals are geared to this goal now. Next slide, please. So move on to, once we found these targets for combination therapies and develop drugs for them, how are we going to effectively test them? That is through our funding to the PNCR and to the industry collaboration, which I'll describe to you next. The PNCR is the Pediatric Neuromuscular Clinical Research Network that has 5 centers in Boston, in Philadelphia, in New York City at Columbia University, at St. Jude's Hospital, and at Stanford University. They've participated in a large natural history study of over 500 patients, which has been used as a benchmark for drug approvals. They began doing this in 2005 with funding from the SMA Foundation. They've developed key outcome measures used globally in SMA trials and helped our industry partners design most of these clinical trials. And since 2018, Cure SMA has been funding them. This year, we're funding them for projects to continue their natural history collection, to have a biorepository of patient samples that can be used in future drug development housed at Columbia, a PT education project, educating physical therapists in SMA outcomes, tracking patients by identified by newborn screening and what their outcomes will be, longitudinal evaluation of adults with SMA, and then developing new outcome measures more appropriate for older patients. They also are going to participate and put data into the clinical data registry that Dr. Schroth will tell you about next. Next slide, please. The other way that we enable clinical trials and drug approvals is through our industry collaboration, which began in 2016, and it was established to collaborate and share experience, expertise, and resources with our pharma partners, as well as other nonprofits like SMA Europe, to more effectively approve drugs in SMA. And our current partners are Novartis Gene Therapies, Biogen, Genentech Roche, Scholar-Rock, and SMA Europe. Next slide, please. And our industry collaboration works by having 4 topic groups where we work on a number of different projects. These include regulatory interactions and outcome measure development, increasing clinical trial site training and capacity, education. The third one is education of HCPs and patients to reduce diagnostic time originally through the Smart Moves campaign with the little umbrella on the left, and then our patient-reported data project to track data longitudinally in the SMA community to understand the changes that are coming. And you can see a number of the projects that we've done listed under these 4 different topic groups. And in the next couple of slides, I'm going to highlight some of the projects we're working on this year. Next slide, please. So through topic group 1, we work a lot on FDA interactions and giving the patient voice and talking about on-neck needs with the FDA. And here you can see a history of our interactions with the FDA, but I just want to highlight our most recent one, which occurred in August of 2020, which is a critical path innovation meeting. Next slide, please. And the goal of this meeting was to discuss the next steps in SMA drug development. And it focused on 4 different topics: continued unmet medical need in older patients with progressing SMA, the development and need for novel outcome measures in SMA, particularly for our older patients, the exploration of novel biomarkers like neurofilament as an indicator of disease progression, possibly when indicating when there's ongoing neural degeneration and a second drug may be required, and also to assess the possible efficacy of a given drug in a clinical trial. And then also to discuss the need and approaches to combination therapies, particularly the design of clinical trials. Next slide, please. Another activity that we are doing in topic group 1, which is an activity that we discussed was important with the FDA, is funding to Dr. Day's site at Stanford for the PNCR to develop a new adult test of neuromuscular disorders called the ATTEND. It's a wheelchair-based assessment that looks at motor function, and it's more appropriate for adults, we hope, in several ways. We hope it's more sensitive to change than the Hammersmith scale, and it also does not require participants to get out of the wheelchair and roll around on the floor the way the children are required to do. So also feel that the comfort level in doing this may be higher for adult patients as well. Next slide, please. In topic group 2, which is the education and awareness topic group, we have a number of campaigns to educate healthcare providers about SMA and the new treatments for SMA with the goal of earlier diagnosis and treatment. And we have product theaters discussing our Smart Moves campaign and other information about SMA at a number of different conferences each year, like the American Academy of Neurology. We also do a number of surveys to look at baseline knowledge of physicians so we can target education appropriately to them. One that we've done here as an example was a pediatrician referral survey, where we discovered that 25 of them are underutilizing tools to look for motor milestone delays, and only 45% of them know that SMA can be diagnosed with a blood test. So you can see we always have continually on education needs for healthcare providers. Next slide, please. Another project that we've undertaken last year and this year in the education topic group is the use of telemedicine and making that more effective for SMA. We did a evaluation telemedicine series with 2 experts in SMA on how to do a remote diagnosis of an infant with hypertonia and motor delays. It has been disseminated and distributed through Neurology Live and HCP Live, and we are hoping that will help healthcare providers diagnose SMA effectively, particularly type 1 SMA, quickly and efficiently by telemedicine in an initial visit. Next slide, please. For topic group 3, one of our big focuses this year is to fund Jackie Montez, who's a physical therapist, and her team at Columbia to develop a worldwide physical therapy training program to teach physical therapists of all experience levels on how to conduct SMA outcome measures, both for clinical trials, but also for ongoing insurance coverage of our approved drugs. This complements our past work in Topic Group 3 in developing new clinical trial sites, where we've trained about 15 new clinical trial sites and developed a clinical trial readiness hub with tools and other information for sites who want to conduct SMA trials. Next slide, please. And this brings us to our last topic group in the industry collaboration, the patient-reported data project, where we track and educate our patient community. We have at Cure SMA 9,000 individuals affected by SMA with SMA in our database. And we use this database primarily to support all of you, but we also do it to help recruit into different research studies and clinical trials to further research goals and to look at real-time changes with our annual survey. Next slide, please. So the Cure SMA membership database, as I said, has 9,000 individuals in it, and we have core data fields on SMA type, date of birth, diagnostic date, SMN2 copy number, and contact information. And then through our various surveys, we collect additional information on treatment status, genetic testing, motor function status, and actually also test other specific patient-reported outcome measures that have been developed. Next slide. And as I said, we collect this survey for our annual Cure SMA patient survey, and we've been doing this for 5 years now. And our survey is opened, and we encourage all of you to participate in it. In 2020, we had 1,200 people complete the survey. This year, we need more. We want to match that. So please participate in the survey. The information is on this slide. And everyone who participates will be entered into a drawing to receive one of 20 prizes, including hotel and registration to our 2020 conference in Disneyland. It's really important that we have this longitudinal or long-term data follow-up of the SMA community, because we use this data to inform regulators, our industry partners, and payers that these drugs really work. And we send many letters to insurers to help with access to SMA, where we include data from these surveys in those letters. And in the next couple of slides, I'll show you some of the data that we collect and how powerful it can be. Next slide, please. So here you look at average age of diagnosis over the last years. In the blue bin, you see historical data prior to drug approval, the first FDA drug approval of Spinraza. And you can see in type 1 and type 2 SMA, we've had a steady decline in the time to diagnosis and treatment, hopefully as well, in our patient populations in type 1 SMA, decreasing from 4.7 months to 2.7 months in 2020. And so that's, this is really wonderful data showing earlier diagnosis and hopefully treatment. Next slide, please. We also asked about needs. What do you want from future drugs? And this is how we can go to we shared this data with the FDA last August and told them that our patients want, have hopes and desires for future drugs. And the top 3 of them in our adult community is gaining muscle strength, achieving new motor outcomes, and improving activities of daily living, leading to more independence. Next slide, please. And, this is a slide that shows whether our patients who self-identify as having type 1 SMA are able to sit or not. And when we first did our survey in March and April of 2017, just a few months after Spinraza was approved, about 12% of type 1 patients had the ability to sit. Now that's approaching 50%. So this is really exciting, and we can really see the impact of these FDA-approved drugs with this data collecting in our survey. And this data is so impactful that it makes us believe that SMA type is becoming obsolete, and we need to beginning to think about SMA more in terms of SMN2 copy number. Of course, this slide also indicates that there is more work to be done so that the other 50% of type 1 patients who cannot sit will have other drug options or drug cocktails to help them continually gain more motor function. Next slide, please. We also, through our industry collaborative, tried to develop patient-reported outcome measures that could be used in clinical trials or other aspects of, say, ongoing insurance approval for the FDA-approved drugs. And we hear from all of you that fatigue can be a big issue in your lives. So recently we tried to validate 4 different fatigue surveys and see instruments and see which of them is most sensitive in SMA and hopefully be used in future clinical trials. And we're always trying to use this survey every year and our other survey projects to find ways to capture data on SMA that is relevant to you and will be sensitive to change and help us approve new drugs. And for example, we have one coming up in the summer to look at bulbar function, meaning things like changes in voice projection and ability to eat oral food. So be on the lookout for that. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I hope during this talk I've given you a snapshot of our strategic goals in research, what we are trying to accomplish, and also how we're trying to accomplish it through our grant funding, through our funding to the PNCR, and through our collaborations for the industry collaboration. And just to summarize, we are doing basic research to hopefully develop novel targets beyond SMN, use our research funding to also test these drug combinations, most likely with different mechanisms of action, SMN upregulators with other types of drugs that impact the motor circuit in animal and cellular models, increase the ability and more effectively test drugs through our funding to increase clinical trial capacity and PT training. Use the PNCR to develop better clinical trial design for our older patients, understand the patient experience and longitudinal changes with our new drugs through patient data collection, and then convey that data to regulators, payers, and healthcare providers to have more effectively advocate for all of you, and then educate HCPs, healthcare providers, to reduce diagnostic delay and make sure that patients are treated as early as possible. So thank you for your time, and I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Mary Schroth to tell you about her work in the clinical care department.
Thank you, Dr. Jarecki. Thank you all for joining us today and allowing me to provide you with clinical care department updates. We're so pleased that you're here joining us as part of the virtual SMA conference. Next slide. I want to start by sharing with you the clinical care department strategic goals. Our overarching goal is to develop an evidence-based SMA standard of care. By creating an evidence-based standard of care, buy-in will be just much greater among clinicians throughout the U.S. as well as internationally. In order to achieve this goal, our plan is to expand the SMA Clinical Data Registry data collection, and we're doing this through adding additional fields and also adding additional patients. And our goals within the registry are to be able to characterize the changing SMA disease phenotype, redefine the SMA disease classification. As Dr. Jarecki just stated, SMA is changing so rapidly, and describing SMA by type is just becoming more difficult. It doesn't mean the same things that it used to mean, which was referencing time of symptom onset and or age of symptom onset and optimal or maximal motor function achieved. And now with the new treatments, some individuals with SMA don't experience symptoms until much later because they've received treatment very early. So talking about type is just becoming more challenging, and we need to better understand how to better classify treated SMA. We also are working to identify changing SMA care needs. Our plan is to expand the SMA Care Center network, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. We want to add more centers, gather more data, have more patients enrolled in the clinical data registry. And our big goal with the Care Center network is to have the registry be representative of the SMA community. So we're trying to have geographic diversity of centers by, do they provide clinical trials or are they not participating in clinical trials? Just looking to, again, more accurately represent SMA care across the U.S. And then we want to take this evidence-based standard of care and educate healthcare providers about SMA. Next slide. We currently have 19 care centers across the U.S. These are established SMA care centers that have partnered with Cure SMA to achieve our goals of collecting data on individuals with SMA, as well as to work on updating the current standard of care about SMA. Cure SMA provides grant funding, and these centers consent patients to have that data of their patients shared back to our registry. Next slide. The goals of the registry are really to establish quality care. We're evaluating the care that is being delivered and looking at outcomes related to care. Quality care should be efficient, evidence-based, and standardized so that everyone receives the same care regardless of where you live and regardless of which center you're receiving your care at. We also want our SMA community to have access to new treatments. So we're using the clinical registry data to advocate to payers so that treatment can be more readily available to the patient community. We're also using the registry to understand the changing disease phenotype. What is the impact of receiving treatments in a certain combination or timeline relative to symptoms, and what are those outcomes? The registry also is designed to eliminate care documentation because what is happening is that electronic medical record data is being packaged at the center, and that information is being transferred securely to our clinical data registry so that the data can be evaluated. Please know that any personal information does not leave our registry. It remains secure in our registry. We do not share that with our partners. The data can also be used for clinical trial site development. So each of the centers that are part of the Care Center network have access to clinical trial readiness toolkits. And our registry can also be used for clinical trial recruitment and also new drug development. Next slide. I want to share with you some of the data from our registry as of today. So this is a slide of our accrual over time of patients. So in June, 2 conferences ago, in June of 2019, there were 73 patients in our registry. In June of 2020, we had 274 patients. And as of today, June 2021, there are 540 patients with data in our clinical data registry. And those patients come from the 19 centers that were listed a few slides back. Next slide. Additional characteristics of patients within the registry include that 41% of the patients have type 2, 29% have type 1, 23% have type 3, and then we have much smaller percentages of pre-symptomatic, 3%, and some are unspecified and unknown. 53% of patients within our clinical data registry have 3 copies of SMN2, 34% have 2 copies. And you can see the remainder. 86% of patients within the clinical data registry have received an SMA treatment. We recognize that this is much greater than the general SMA population community. And I'm actually pleased that 86% of the patients in the registry, that means that the centers that are part of our registry are doing a great job of offering treatments to the patients that they serve. Next slide. So our goal with the clinical data registry is to ultimately achieve representation of about 25% of everyone with SMA. And our goal is to achieve this by 2024. In order to achieve this, we anticipate adding a total of 50 centers to the Care Center network, and anticipate that those 50 centers will be able to provide us with approximately 2,500 patients. Next. This information that we're collecting is real-world evidence. And what we mean by real-world evidence is this is the information that is collected after medications are approved. The 3 FDA-approved treatments have been approved. It's information regarding people who are receiving these treatments outside of a clinical trial. This is real life, real world evidence. And we'll use that information to, again, establish evidence-based standard of care. It also helps us to further evaluate these new therapies and also the impact of combination therapies. And again, provide evidence to payers to increase access to treatments. We'll also use this data to provide accreditation to centers. We are establishing benchmarks for each of the centers as they deliver care to patients. And within the next few years, we will be offering an accreditation program for each of these centers. They will need to reach a certain level of care demonstrated by within their data in order to receive a Cure SMA accreditation as a care center. Next slide. We have established a real-world evidence collaboration with multiple partners and stakeholders in the SMA community. And the real-world evidence collaboration was established to leverage the experience, expertise, and resources of pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies, as well as nonprofit organizations involved in SMA, so that we could guide the future direction of real-world evidence collection and use in SMA. The real-world evidence collaboration is currently comprised of our partners at Novartis Gene Therapies, Biogen, Genentech, Roche Pharmaceuticals, and SMA Europe. And the work that I've described regarding the Care Center network, expanding the data, clinical data elements within the clinical data registry, and also validating that data is part of this work. In addition, we have a project where we are working with key opinion leaders and experienced SMA clinicians to discuss 3 areas related to standard of care. And those 3 areas for this year are diagnosis of SMA, treatment considerations, exploring the 3 FDA-approved treatments, and also mental health and SMA. Our plan for subsequent years is to establish work groups to cover additional topic areas within SMA standard of care. Next slide. I'm going to shift gears a little bit to talk about SMA newborn screening. This is a map of the current states that are screening for SMA. The most recently added state is Texas, and we're so pleased that we currently have 37 states screening for SMA, and this represents 85% of all infants born in the U.S. Next slide. Additional information includes on the right is our quarterly growth of what has occurred since 2017, when the first pilot for SMA was established in New York. And then in early 2018, several states established permanent newborn screening. Utah and Minnesota led the way. And then in July of 2018, SMA newborn screening was added to the recommended newborn screening panel, which is the federal panel that guides states about which disorders to screen for. And so we will be celebrating our 3-year anniversary of having SMA added to the federal recommended uniform screening panel next month. But there's been steady progress, and actually our progress has been ahead of schedule. We're just so pleased at the progress that's being made. SMA reaches out to the state labs to ask them to report back to us the number of babies identified in their state through newborn screening and how many babies they've screened. As of this month, more than 100,000 infants have been screened for SMA in the U.S., and this dates back to January of 2018. And this is 28 states reporting of the 37 states that are currently screening. Our preliminary incidence is approximately 1 in 14,000 births. We previously had identified that it was 1 in 11,000 births, but this number appears to be changing. 85% of infants, as I said earlier, are screened for SMA in the U.S. And we anticipate that by year end, the end of 2021, 93% of all infants will be screened for SMA. Next slide. SMA has a newborn screening registry, and we invite all parents who have a child who is identified by newborn screening or was prenatally identified as having SMA to join in our newborn screening registry efforts. We're collecting information about infants who were identified very early and what has happened. This survey asks approximately 25 questions about your infant and date of diagnosis, date of when they received treatment, if they received treatment, symptoms that were present at birth. This information is incredibly valuable to us to help us understand the impact of newborn screening on SMA. And I encourage you to go to the website to provide us with that information. On the right is some data that we're sharing from that registry. There are currently 40 infants that are in the registry, and this is a graphic of median days from diagnosis to actual treatment. And there were 33 infants that are part of this graph. An average, or median days for all newborns in this group was 22 days. For 1 copy babies, it was 11 days, and there were 3 infants that were in that category. For 2 copy babies, it was 17 days, and you can see the range at the bottom of the graph. For 3 copy babies, 24 days, and for 4 or more copies, it was 37 days with a very large range. We hope that what we're seeing over time is less and less time from diagnosis to treatment, again, for those who are choosing treatment or readily have treatment available to them. We would like to see this to be less than 2 weeks. So again, help us with this data collection by going to the website curosma.org/NBSR. Thank you for your consideration and your participation. Next slide. My next several slides will just review the current FDA treatments. So my first slide is about Spinraza. Spinraza was approved in December of 2016. This is an SMN2 splicing modifier, so the backup gene. It modifies it so there's more SMN protein produced. It's given intrathecally or by lumbar puncture or spinal tap. Those all mean the same thing. And 4 loading doses are given over 2 months, and then maintenance doses every 4 months. The FDA label was for all types, all ages, and 3,200 patients have received Spinraza in the U.S. As of first quarter of 2021, with more than 11,000 worldwide. And you can find treatment centers at the curosma.org/find-a-location website. On the graphic on the right is the pivotal data that was presented to the FDA in order to achieve approval. Next slide. The next slide reviews Spinraza payer policies. One of the things that we do at SMA is to monitor payer policies. Again, we are working with our industry partners and also with payers to advocate for access. So payer policies for Spinraza, and again, we've had Spinraza for 4.5 years. It's very good for SMA types 1, 2, and 3, SMN2 copy numbers of 2, 3, or 4, and pediatric and adult individuals. And it's restrictive for type 0 and type 4, 1 copy of SMN2, and if an individual is trach dependent or dependent on BiPAP. You can see the green just represents policies that are favorable to various conditions, and red is not favorable or excluding. And in the first column of each of those charts is the name of the commercial payer, and on the right. And this information will be available on the website at kerosene.org/Spinraza, and you can take a closer look at these graphics. Next slide. The next treatment that I want to talk about is Zolgensma. Zolgensma was approved in May of 2019. It is an SMN1 gene replacement therapy. It replaces the function of the SMN1 gene. It is a one-time administration given intravenously. It is approved for children under the age of 2 years for all copies of SMN2 and all types. Currently, more than 720 patients have been treated in the U.S. And more than 1,300 worldwide. And on the right is the pivotal data that was submitted to the FDA to achieve approval. Next slide. Payer policies for Zolgensma have expanded some. They're very good for type 1, 2 copies of SMN2, and prior Spinraza treatment. They're good for up to 2 years of age. There are some policies that restrict to less than 6 months of age, and for 1 and 3 copies of SMN2. They're restrictive for type 0, 2, and 3, and 4 copies of SMN2. But I encourage that if you've experienced these restrictions for any of the medications, I encourage you and your healthcare team to appeal and keep pushing, and let us know, and we also will help to appeal to those particular payers to expand their policies. This information is available, and the graphic is available at the Kerosene/Zolgensma website. Next slide. So Evrysdi is the third treatment that is available for SMA. This was approved less than a year ago in August of 2020. Evrysdi also is an SMN2 splicing modifier, resulting in increased SMN protein production. It is given orally or by feeding tube on a daily basis. The data on the right is the pivotal data that was made available to the FDA for approval. Currently, more than 1,800 patients were treated in the U.S., again, as of first quarter 2021, and more than 3,000 worldwide. Next slide. Payer policies for access to Evrysdi have increased significantly over the last 6 months. And we're seeing very good reimbursement for SMA type 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, and 4 copies of SMN2, both pediatric and adult, using BiPAP, being ambulatory or prior Spinraza therapy. And just as a reminder, Evrysdi is approved for people over the age of 2 months with SMA, all copy numbers, all types. Evrysdi policies have been restrictive for type 0 and 4, tracheostomy dependence, having prior Zolgensma treatment, and they're restricting concurrent Spinraza treatment along with Evrysdi. And again, this information is available at the website in the lower right. Next slide. So I want to emphasize that as you think about treatments, I encourage you to evaluate and discuss these treatments with your treatment team. Review the safety and efficacy data, how it's given, practical and process timing issues. From the Cure SMA side, we recommend that you don't wait for future treatment or wait for a clinical trial. Early treatment results in the best outcomes. Next. Keep in mind that we say that time is neurons. And next slide. Early treatment results in the best outcomes. Next slide. It's also really important to continue close follow-up with your healthcare team after receiving treatment. It's critically important to optimize these treatments by maintaining standard of care. I think about health as being something that we think about every day. You have to do some work every day to maintain your health, and doing that monitoring along with your healthcare team is just critically important. The healthcare team will help monitor for SMA symptoms and side effects of the treatment. It's very important to get immunizations, keep those up to date. And also seeing your healthcare provider, your neuromuscular healthcare team, SMA care team, they'll continue to provide you with new information about SMA options for treatment and new things that are coming out. Next slide. I now want to share with you information about COVID-19 and its impact on the SMA community. On the slide is data from our survey with a data cut from January of this year. Thank you to all who have completed the COVID-19 surveys for us. It's been very helpful for us to monitor what is happening in the community. And again, we thank you for your participation. We've seen multiple things improve: access to healthcare providers, access to treatments, access to supportive therapies. The hospitalization rates increased somewhat, and also the number of people who had symptoms or were diagnosed with SMA increased and was up to 19% back in January. We know as of today there are 50 people who have had COVID who have SMA. To our knowledge, we have not lost anyone to SMA and COVID, but I can tell you that as of today, we strongly encourage you to receive your COVID-19 vaccine. We have not had reports of people having adverse effects related to having SMA and also receiving that vaccine. So the best way to protect yourself with the current technology and what is available to us is to receive the COVID-19 vaccine. It's not perfect. People still can acquire COVID, but it is right now the best defense from a public health perspective to prevent COVID infection. Next slide. I want to acknowledge the Kerosene Medical Advisory Council. This is a group of dedicated healthcare providers from a variety of disciplines who work with us, Kerosene as an organization, to guide our educational programs, not only for families, but also for healthcare providers. Please see the program for the list of MAC members and also our website. The Medical Advisory Council helps guide the clinical care meeting, which provides education credits, continuing education credits for healthcare providers, and we anticipate over 400 clinicians from around the world participating this year. It's an opportunity for networking as well as SMA care discussions. Our speakers also will be providing workshops in the virtual SMA conference this year, and you'll see them. I'm talking about a variety of topics, and also the Summit of Strength speakers. Our MAC has been instrumental in providing presentations at Summit of Strength events. Next slide. So I just want to point out other areas just of information for you. We have our COVID-19 Information Center on our website. We also have updated Care Series booklets in English and Spanish, but I want to let you know that the Understanding SMA is available in 9 languages for download. The genetics of SMA has been updated. and the Community Support Services booklet has been updated. A new booklet offering is Caring for Emotional and Mental Health, and this is a fabulous booklet that I encourage you to download or contact us and we will mail it out to you. The Stemmas of Strength program is a local one-day program for people of all ages and types of SMA, where we bring essentially a small part of this conference to your local community. Please, and we are just so excited to be in person again, to be with you in your communities, giving these presentations, meeting, chatting, networking. It's just so fabulous to be in person. And I cannot tell you how excited we are for the 2022 annual SMA conference in person. It'll just be so wonderful to see everyone and connect again. Next slide. We also create healthcare professional education. These are three of several programs that are available to healthcare providers to receive continuing education, continuing medical education credits, and learn more about SMA. Next slide. So as a reminder, this conference, this 2021 Virtual SMA Conference is for you. Please provide your questions to webinars in advance, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can. And please, please, please provide feedback. We realize that this is virtual. We're pleased to provide it to you. And again, we're so excited for next year. But please let us know if there's topics and workshops that you really liked. We hope to be able to provide them to you in person next year. So again, please provide us with feedback. We depend on you telling us what you'd like us to do, your needs, because we're here to support you. Next slide. So I want to thank you so much for your attention and being with us today. I look forward again to seeing you all next year.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you, Jill, for such a great and informative presentation today. Hi, everyone. This is Sarah with Kerosene's Family Support Department, and I also want to extend our appreciation for everyone who was able to join in. There is a survey linked in the agenda, and you're also going to be receiving a follow-up email with this survey link, so we would greatly appreciate any feedback that you have to share. And once again, we're incredibly thankful for the support from our sponsors for making the 2021 Virtual SMA Conference possible. Please join us this evening as we close out the 2021 Virtual SMA Conference with the Conference Community Closing Social at 6:30 p.m. Central Time. Be sure to wear your conference t-shirt or other Kerosene gear. If there's anything that we can do for you, or if you have any additional questions, please email us at familysupport@kerosene.org. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 2021 Virtual SMA Conference.